Hi Becca.
Hello, Ali.
So in this video we want to talk a little bit about reading the Bible as a whole book. Also, as I said earlier, it's lots of books, but it's one book, a unified book as well. And sometimes that's spoken of as the canon of Scripture, reading the Bible as a whole canon. And that, I think, massively affects how we read each particular part, and we put it in the context of the big story of what the Bible is. Do you have any particular reflections on that? Have you had any experiences of that? Any thoughts on what it means to read the Bible in that way?
Yeah, I think it changes and shapes the way you read every passage when you think about how it fits into like a grander narrative of things. Because you can see both how a lot of books of the Bible have a kind of way that they speak directly of all of the story of God, but also you can see how this fits into like a smaller facet of what the story of God is. And I think what's helpful for me when I'm thinking of that is that I can then place myself in the story and see where I fit in to Scripture and which parts are speaking directly to me, which is all of it, but also seeing how we are part of the story of God and what He's doing. How about you?
Yeah, I think I just come back to interpreting it rightly again, and God has chosen to give us a book of books, which sounds a bit strange, but yeah, like this one book of all these different books. And I think if I read one book of the Bible in isolation from the other books, then I might distort how my understanding of that book and what God's intent is. So I've got a few examples in my mind. So one would be something like the Song of Songs. It's an interesting book if you try and read it. Taken on its own, people might think this isn't appropriate Christian literature because it could be seen as quite pornographic, quite overly erotic material. But actually, when it's put in the context of the whole of the Bible and placed within God's vision for Christian marriage, we see actually it's a celebration of human sexuality within the context of marriage, and then it becomes quite powerful. We understand it in the light of Genesis 1 and 2 and marriage's intention, but also when we put it in the context of the New Testament as well. So the whole big story, we see that it points not only to human marriage but to the marriage between Jesus and His church, which all human marriages point to. And so it can also be read in a way that the bride and bridegroom in the story represent Jesus and the church and Jesus, which is powerful. So it's kind of taking that. It gives it a new meaning when we read it in the light of the whole of Scripture. We can also do that not just with books, but with particular verses. So in Exodus chapter 32 and verse 14, there's this. It comes up a few times in the Bible, but there's this phrase where it speaks about God's going to destroy Israel because they've been sinful. Moses prays, and it says God nichams, which means to relents or changes his mind. And you might think, oh, if I read that verse on its own, then our God's a bit of a wishy-washy God. Like he's always changing his mind. He's doing this thing, and now Moses prayed. Now he's doing this thing. Does he not have like set purposes? But then when you read it in light of other verses, like there's a verse in Numbers. I can't remember exactly where in Numbers, but in Numbers and in 1 Samuel, where it says that God is not like a human that He lies or changes His mind. Same word niham. So in one verse it says He does niham, in another word it says He doesn't niham, like a human. So whatever it does or doesn't mean, it can't mean that God's like changeable like a human is. He's not always changing His mind. And then you read other verses like in Isaiah where it talks about how like the great sovereignty of God, His purposes stand from beginning to end. He's unchanging in all of His ways. And again, you see then this verse in Exodus 32 can't be that God is a really changeable, like a human being creature. So we don't have time to go in what I do think it means. But I think just in short, I think it means that God is relational, and his relational character. He's still utterly sovereign, but in prayer there's a relational dimension to how He operates in this world, which affects the way that He acts, which means that prayer actually does something. But yeah, I just think reading verses in isolation, reading books in isolation can be dangerous. But when we read it in the whole of the Scripture, we understand it. So actually, there's this phrase that Scripture interprets Scripture, which is really helpful. So when there's particularly bits that you find hard, don't understand, we can ask, how do the more obvious bits of scripture shed light on these more complex bits that I'm finding difficult?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it helps us to see, like, it's a similar idea to if someone brings a prophetic word, often my first thought is to weigh it against scripture. And so you can weigh what you think a certain passage or verse is saying against another bit of scripture. So like the example you just gave, if one piece of scripture says that God is like this, then it helps us to understand that in the other scripture, God is still going to be like that, because across the whole story of the Bible, God remains who he says he is at the beginning. And so if he says something about himself, that remains true. And whenever we read another piece of scripture, we can use that to help us understand.
Yeah. And that really helps with this false idea that people sometimes have, that like God's like this kind of wrathful, angry God in the Old Testament, and then Jesus comes and he suddenly becomes loving God. But actually, when you realise this is the same God who's revealed himself in Jesus, and you see there's some things that Jesus does which he gets righteously angry at times, both in like overturning tables in the temple, but also in Revelation 19 when he returns to judge and make war. And you see the deep compassion of God in the Old Testament as well, and his mercy and his grace over and over again. You kind of see how it all fits into this one big story. On that idea of the Bible being a story, we talked a little bit about being a canon, and you said earlier about placing yourself in the story, so we've hinted at it already, but sometimes people speak about the Bible as a story. What do you think they mean by that? What's it mean to read the Bible as a story?
Well, I think there's a kind of overarching story that runs across the whole of it, which you're going to help me remember the words that N.T. Wright uses. Creation.
Yes, there's like so Tom Wright talks about the Bible in 5 acts, like a play in 5 acts. So it's not. There's other people who say similar things, but Act 1 is creation, so that's pretty short. Genesis 1 and 2. Act 2 is the fall, very short. Genesis 3. Actually, no, 3 chapter 3 to 11, which is the consequences of the fall, and then Act 3, which is the longest one by far, is Israel, which is Genesis 12, the calling of Abraham, all the way through to the end of the Old Testament. But that's an interesting one, because we often just pause on that Act 3. Is we often, although it's the longest one, it's the one that many of us as Christians know the least. And so that's something we maybe need to challenge ourselves, because that's really important, because to understand the rest of the act properly, it's like any play. If you miss out Act 3, you're not properly going to understand Act 4 and 5, which is Act 4 being Jesus, so the Gospels really, and then Act 5 is the church. Some people add Act 6 for new creation, which is fine. Obviously we're not there yet, but that's one in the future. But it's that's really important. So Genesis, Act 1, creation, like laid all the foundations. That like it's only 2 chapters, but it's so significant. There's so much in Genesis 1 and 2. Like we spend ages going through Genesis 1 and 2, really kind of understanding things about the nature of humanity, the nature of God Himself, creation, marriage, all sorts of stuff that comes into that. And then the fall, and then I say Israel, Jesus, and the church. Yeah.
And I think all of those inform the other ones in some way as well. Like as you said, we need to understand Israel to understand the Jesus part and the and the church part and the new creation part. If you do add the 6th act, I think I think I find it tricky, particularly the Israel part, because Genesis is the same. Talking about context in the previous video, Genesis is written in the same way, and then the Gospels are written in the same way, and then the latter part is largely letters of the New Testament. But the Israel part is like, there's a bit of history, there's a bit of poetry, there's a bit of prophecy, there's a kind of whole confusing order in that they're not chronological largely. There's some that like come earlier but are later in the Bible, which is confusing. But I think understanding particularly that part of scripture fits into the lens of Israel is really helpful. Like there's a verse in Judges, which is, I think you've mentioned before, that everyone did what there was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel. and there are kings at various points in the Israel section, but I find that as a really helpful phrase to help me see the kind of framework of Israel throughout. It's useful to like zoom in on each individual part of the Israel story in terms of like exile and Exodus and all of those things, but actually that's a really helpful framework for me to understand that God is with his people, but they're doing kind of what they want to do until Jesus comes back.
Yeah. And I think also understanding the Bible as a story means that it helps us to know where we are in that story right now, which is really important for interpreting the Bible. So you read different parts of the Bible differently depending on which act it's in. So we're in Act 4, which is the church.
Yeah.
You could call it Act 4, Scene 2, because Scene 1 is what's in the scripture, like Acts and the letters. We're now kind of in a different context, but still in the same act, which is important. So the way we read commands and instructions in Paul's letters is different to how we read laws in the Old Testament, for example, because we're in a different act. Not arbitrarily, it's because we're in a different act. So the way I think about it is any unless it's obviously not something for us right now, as in it's. So there's one example would be Paul in 1 or 2 Timothy tells Timothy to get his parchments from Troas or something. We're not going to go to Troas and find Paul's parchments, or whatever I think it's parchments. So that's an obvious common sense one that's not applied for us today. But any commands generally in the New Testament, in the letters, are applicable to us today because we're in the same act, I would say. There might be some, which we'll come on to maybe a bit later, some cultural translation that needs to happen sometimes to make it understandable in our context, but I would say it's the principle behind it is always applicable for us, whereas the laws in the Old Testament aren't necessarily. In fact, I would say we have no obligation to obey Old Testament laws unless they're restated in some way in the New Testament, in the act we currently live in. That's my understanding of how I read the Old Testament laws. So the Ten Commandments, for example, we don't just follow the Ten Commandments because we think they're the best ones, but because in some way they're all restated in the New Testament, I would suggest. Whereas the reason we don't, like for example, well, all sorts of things, but we can eat pork today, we can have bacon, which is great, is because like Jesus has fulfilled that part on the cross, and the food distinctions, food laws that talked about kind of holy and unholy stuff. We still have holiness code, but the holiness code looks different because of the cross in how we're called to live today. So yeah, that for me is quite important. Know what act we're in, and the way assume New Testament commands are applicable for us today. Assume Old Testament commands aren't something we should be doing today unless in some way Jesus or the New Testament writers affirms them. That's how I understand it. What about some of the harder bits? So we could say, like in the New Testament, for example, if we take what I've just said as how we should interpret the Bible, like in 1 Corinthians 11, it talks about women praying, prophesying with coverings on the head, but we don't do that in our church. So why don't we do that? Have you got any thoughts on that? Put you on the spot. I've got some thoughts, but I'll let you, as the woman, can start first.
I recommend a sermon that I've listened to that you gave, Ali.
Oh, right. That's very lovely. But you can't remember it, so no, can you?
Well, I can remember some aspects of it. I think, using 1 Corinthians 11 as an example, I know some churches that do still do head coverings. So I think for me that wouldn't be like I would use the term gospel issue of like, it wouldn't be something that I'd say those people aren't saved.
No.
Come to a different conclusion. I think that probably feeds quite a lot into the context stuff that we were talking about and what the original author intended.
Yeah.
That fitting into the like grander narrative of the Bible, for the church today, it's important to think of the why Paul says that in 1 Corinthians and what he intended to say. So it's true that is still applicable to us, like you just said, as the New Testament is largely stuff that would still be applicable to us now, but we take the spirit of it in terms of what Paul was intending to say to the church then, rather than like the literal put on a head covering now when you're prophesying.
Yeah, and that's really good. And I think that's kind of why I talked earlier about I've heard it spoken about as translating the symbols, so like some cultural translation needed. So the head covering had a symbolic power in that day of like if you had your head uncovered as a woman, it would show that you were kind of available, and particularly as for a married woman, that would be inappropriate and disrespectful to a husband. If you come with your head uncovered in our context, it doesn't mean the same thing. The symbol means differently.
Absolutely.
So it's so the principle behind it, though, I still think is act respectfully towards your husbands in church, and so I think that principle can be carried on, whatever that might look like. So it might mean dressing in appropriately still, just not what you wear on your head probably isn't the same the same applicability. So I think what we can sometimes do is throw it all out and say, oh, that is a different culture, that's nothing to do with us, let's just ignore 1 Corinthians 11, whereas I think again some hard work needs to be done and dig as you've already said, get the timeless principle underneath the cultural casing. I used the casing word before, I'll use it again, I quite like it. What's the principle that want to apply today?
And I think when we read through some of the stuff in the Old Testament that isn't directly applicable to us, we can still see something of the character of God through it that can be directly applicable. So we can see how the Old Testament fitting into the bigger story still makes the principles that are there, even though they might not be direct. You have to not eat pork, or you shouldn't wear clothes that are two mixed fabrics, or whatever it might be. Or a lot of the stuff that I love when I read the law is stuff about like sanitation and the kindness of God and the kind of thoughtfulness of God and teaching people how to live and things like that. That there is still a timeless principle that we can apply when we see the grander narrative of who God is and the things that we see in each of these aspects of the story. It can enable us to interpret and understand Scripture, even if it's not directly, you need to do this or that.
Yeah, that's great. One final thought I have, it's a practical thing, is I think if you're watching this and you feel like you don't really know the story of the Bible or the grand story, I would encourage you to do that. So one thing I would encourage everyone to do is to read through the whole Bible at some point. Now, personally, I don't read the Bible in a year. I find it too much to read in 1 year, but some people love doing that and do that on a regular basis. But I do try to get over probably more like 3 years period, get through the whole of the Bible. So don't just choose kind of bits that you always liked or would go to, but try to be a bit systematic and even have a list of books that you've read and tick them off as you've done them. That would be one thing, but also that might take you a while to read the whole Bible if you're anything like me, and it takes you 3 years. But the other thing you can do in really short term is there's something called the Bible course online, which one of our community groups at church is running at the moment. But I'm pretty sure you can access it yourself. If not, we can find access for you, I'm sure. Which is like an 8-part video series, which just goes through the story of the Bible and just helps you get into it. I think, however, you can somehow really get this framework in your mind, this play in 5 acts, as I mentioned. That will really help you as you're reading, and then ask each time I read this, what act am I in? What part of the story am I in? And how does that affect how I'm reading this?
And another plug for the Bible Project, which is also
Bible
really
Project,
helpful for that.
Brilliant.
I once did a walk through the Bible as well when I was younger, which I would recommend. I don't know if they're doing them anywhere, but you did like 3 hours and they went through the whole of the Bible. You learn actions and everything.
Wow.
I don't know if I'd recommend that for everyone, but I enjoyed it when I was like 12. There we go.
Thanks, Bekah.